How you actually load your thread onto your sewing machine can have a huge impact on how well that thread will perform while you are sewing. Even if you have a really good quality thread, if you have loaded it onto your machine the incorrect way, you can have problems with it snagging or snapping or giving you inconsistent tension. And all of those things are very frustrating and we want to avoid them. So that is why this theory is so important. It is also something that is quite often overlooked or people just don't really understand. They just think you can load any old thread onto your machine in any way and expect it to perform well. But that's not always the case. So hopefully by explaining the differences between the ways you can load your thread and the different types of thread, you can overcome some problems if you ever find you're having them, and you can learn a little bit more about how to best use your machine in the process. So most machines will have two thread loading options. You will have a vertical pin where the cone or spool of thread will be standing up, and you will have a horizontal pin where the thread will be lying down. Some sewing machines will only have one thread loading option. For example, my very old Bonina machine only has a vertical pin, and I have seen many machines come through my workshops these days that only have a horizontal pin. As a result, it's really important to understand the different types of threads and which like to be loaded in different ways, so you can make sure you're purchasing thread that will work well in your machine. So there are really two styles of thread, or two ways that you will buy thread from a sewing store. You can buy a cone of thread, or you can buy a spool of thread. Now, a cone of thread is very common when we look at machine embroidery threads. All the threads that I use come as cones. A cone has a very clear top and a very clear base. Generally, the thread is wound on in a crisscross fashion, so you'll see the thread crossing over itself many times. And when you have a cone of thread, the thread is designed to unwind from the top of the cone, so following that cone shape. And for that reason, the best way to load a cone of thread is onto your horizontal pin. That way the cone is snugly stuck in place. It's not wobbling around or having to spin like it would if it was on your vertical pin. And most importantly, the thread is winding off the top of the cone. So it's winding off the way it is designed, and you're going to get the best results that way. If you have a very large cone of thread like this one, it's not going to fit on your horizontal pin. It's just too big. So you're going to need something like a thread stand to make using this thread possible on your machine. Thread stands aren't that expensive, and they're actually very basic. Really, they just provide an extra threading point so that the thread can unwind off the cone the way it's meant to and then run smoothly through your machine. So it just sits behind the machine, clips through there, and then threads through your machine like normal. And as the thread is wound off the cone and running through your machine, you can see it's coming off the top of the cone. And that is the way a cone of thread is happy unwinding. Now, if you have very large cones like this, but you don't have a thread stand at the moment, a little hack is you can get a paper clip and stick it to a strategic point on the back of your sewing machine. Then you just put the cone underneath that extra threading point that you've added, thread through the loop of the paper clip, thread your machine like normal, and hopefully that cone of thread will unwind vertically and run smoothly through your machine. It works in a pinch anyway, but nothing really beats a proper thread stand. The other way that you will buy thread is a spool of thread. Spools come in all sorts of different sizes and heights, but really the thing we need to be aware of in regards to thread loading is how the thread has been wound onto the spool, because that will affect how it likes to come off the spool. The first one type that I will talk about, also the most common, is a crisscross wound spool. So very similar to the way thread is wound onto a cone of thread, a crisscross wound spool will cross over itself many, many times. And these are quite versatile. This type of thread is quite happy coming off the top of the spool. It is also quite happy coming off the side of the spool. So you can load it on either the vertical or the horizontal pin. If you've got a choice though, I would probably recommend you put it on the horizontal pin. Again, it's just locked into place there, so the thread will come off nice and smoothly, and the actual spool won't have to sort of spin around like it would if it was on the vertical pin. So horizontal pin if you can, with a crisscross wound spool. The other type of spool that you will find, which is becoming rarer and rarer these days, is one that is wound as a continual line. It is wound on the spool in the same way that our bobbin is wound on. So the thread will not cross over itself at any point. With a spool that is wound this way, these are designed so that the thread comes off the side of the spool. That's the way it's happiest. So you want to always put this style of spool of thread onto your vertical pin. Yes, it will physically spin around on that pin, but the thread will come off sideways as it's designed to. If you were to put this spool of thread on your horizontal pin and you were to make the thread come off the top of the spool, you would have a problem in that every time that thread comes off the spool, you're adding an extra twist to the yarn. It might be a bit hard to see in this small example, so to illustrate that a little bit better, I've just got a spool of ribbon here. So imagine this is the same as our thread spool. If it is loaded vertically and it comes off the side of the spool, the thread unwinds as a big, long, nice, smooth, continuous line. But if we turn the spool onto its side and make the thread come off the top of the spool, you can see every time it loops around, it's adding an extra twist to the spool. Sorry, adding an extra twist to the thread. And where this twist can become problematic is those twists all build up as it's running through your machine, and they can cause issues when they go through your tension disc. They can also cause issues when they go through your needle. So these extra twists and this inconsistently twisted yarn can cause all those extra snags and snaps and things that we want to avoid. So if you have any of these spools that are wound in this style, vertical pin only, please. Now, in saying all of that, I have had plenty of threads in my collection that I have loaded the technically wrong way onto my sewing machine, and they've worked just fine. Likewise, I've had many people come through my workshops who are loading threads in ways that are technically not the happiest ways for those threads to behave, and they've had no problems. So, like always, if you have a particular style of thread already and you want to try using it with these techniques, just load it up however you can on your machine and see how it performs. If it performs well, great, you don't have a problem. But if you do start to have problems, maybe this thread loading theory will help to overcome those problems, and you'll know now that just a few little changes in how you load your thread, or perhaps the type of thread that you buy, will give you a much happier, snag and snap free sewing experience, which is really what we all want, right?